If you already own a Fujifilm X camera, the best lens for it may not be one of Fujifilm's newest designs. Hidden behind the current LM/WR and high-resolution glass are several older XF primes that built this system in the first place, and some of them still make more sense on the used market than their age suggests. Number 1, however, was so specialized that Fujifilm eventually stopped making anything quite like it. This is alt-buzz lenses, where the glass everyone forgot gets a second look. So if that sounds like your kind of rabbit hole, tap subscribe and stay with us. 5 lenses, 1 question, and it starts now. At number 5, we have the Fujinon XF 60mm f2.4 R macro. This was one of the lenses sitting on shelves when the original X Pro 1 arrived, back when Fujifilm was still deciding what its mirrorless system would even be. It never announced itself as a masterpiece. It just quietly did 2 jobs at once. Shot wide open at portrait distance, it behaves like a short telephoto, somewhere near 91mm of equivalent reach, soft enough in the background to flatter a face. Move closer, and it shifts into close-up work, capable of half-life size magnification. Not true one-to-one macro, and the lens never pretended otherwise, but enough to make texture and detail feel tactile. At around 215 grams, it barely registers on a wrist strap, and its minimum focusing distance keeps close-up work genuinely usable rather than theoretical. Fujifilm has since moved it off current production, which on its own tells you where the company's attention shifted. On the used market, it typically trades somewhere in the low to mid hundreds of dollars, depending on condition, making it one of the more approachable ways into both macro and short telephoto shooting, without buying 2 lenses to cover the same ground. That honesty is part of why it slipped out of the conversation. Newer Fujifilm macro glass arrived with greater magnification, quicker focusing, and the kind of confident autofocus this older design was never built for. On paper, the case against keeping it looks simple. In practice, the 60mm still earns its place in a bag for a very specific reason. It is small, it is light, it is inexpensive on the used market, and it still performs 2 roles that would otherwise require 2 separate lenses. For a photographer who wants one prime that can drift between portraits and close detail without a lens change, that dual identity has not gone anywhere. It only stopped being talked about. At number 4, we have the Fujinon XF 18mm F2 R. If the 60mm proved Fujifilm could build something purposeful early on, the 18mm proved it could build something small. This was one of the tiniest lenses the X-mount ever produced. A pancake prime built for cameras like the original X Pro and XE bodies, when the whole appeal of the system was that it did not need to look or feel like a professional rig. At a 27mm equivalent field of view, it sits in that useful gap between a classic 24 and a classic 35, wide enough to hold context, tight enough to still feel intentional. It weighs barely over 100 grams and measures only a few centimeters from mount to front element, which is part of why it still shows up in minimalist kits built around travel and street work. Fujifilm quietly discontinued it years ago, and used copies now circulate for well under $200 in most conditions, often less than a third of what the newer F1.4 version costs. For a photographer building a second, lighter body just for walking around, that price gap alone changes the calculation. Then Fujifilm released the 18mm F1.4 LMWR, and the comparison became lopsided fast. Faster aperture, modern autofocus, weather sealing, a level of optical ambition the original was never designed to chase. On a specification sheet, the newer lens wins almost every category, and the early autofocus motor in the original does show its age when tested against it. But specification sheets do not carry a camera around a city for 8 hours. The 18mm's real argument in 2026 is not that it competes with its replacement, it is that it barely exists as a physical object, and paired with a small Fujifilm body, it recreates a kind of quiet, pocketable shooting experience the newer, larger lens was never trying to offer in the first place. At number 3, we have the Fujinon XF f14mm f2.8 R. This is the lens in the countdown, most likely to be underestimated at first glance. No fast aperture headline, no dramatic backstory, just a compact ultra-wide prime sitting near a 21mm equivalent field of view. But spend time with independent testing on this lens, and one property keeps surfacing. Its geometric distortion is unusually well controlled for an ultra-wide of its era, and for anyone shooting architecture, interiors, or tight urban scenes, that single trait can matter more than an extra stop of light. Its minimum focusing distance is close enough to let foreground elements anchor a wide composition, something not every ultra-wide prime manages gracefully, and its optical formula was built with barrel and pincushion distortion correction as a central design goal rather than an afterthought. Fujifilm has left it off its most recent marketing pushes, which tend to spotlight lenses optimized for the newest, highest resolution sensors. But the 14mm remains available on the secondary market at prices that regularly undercut newer wide-angle options by a significant margin. As the Fujifilm lineup expanded, the 14mm found itself surrounded by faster wide primes, wider ultra-wide zooms, better autofocus systems, and glass optimized specifically for the resolution of newer sensors. None of that made the 14mm worse. It simply made it quieter. It stopped being the lens anyone reached for first, even while it kept doing the one thing it always did well. For a photographer whose work actually depends on straight lines staying straight, a compact, low-cost, distortion-disciplined ultra-wide is not a nostalgic pick. It is a practical one that happens to be easy to forget. If you are the kind of viewer who actually reads lens history instead of just chasing megapixel counts, you already know why this channel exists. Consider this your halfway checkpoint. Subscribe if you want more of these rediscoveries, because we are only 2 lenses away from the one that started this whole conversation. At number 2, we have the original Fujinon X f23mm f1.4 R, not the newer LMWR version. This chapter belongs entirely to the lens Fujifilm released back in 2013, the one that quietly became the backbone of early professional Fujifilm work. At a 35mm equivalent field of view, it landed in the exact focal length that documentary photographers, wedding shooters, and street photographers had built entire careers around long before mirrorless even existed. This was not a lens that photographers merely liked. Long-term users, including well-documented professional shooters, leaned on it for years of paid work, not weekend experimentation. At roughly 300 grams, it carried real heft for its size, a small but tangible clue to the quality of glass Fujifilm packed inside it. Its mechanical focus clutch let photographers snap between autofocus and manual focus without touching a menu, a physical gesture that newer, more electronic lens designs have largely abandoned. Fujifilm has since discontinued the original in favor of its replacement, and used copies now sell for a fraction of the newer lens, often making it the more accessible entry point into that specific 35mm Fujifilm look that shaped how an entire generation of photographers thought about the system. Eventually, Fujifilm replaced it with the LMWR version, and the improvements were real. Faster, more confident autofocus, weather sealing, closer minimum focus, optical correction tuned for higher resolution sensors. Nobody serious argues the original outperforms its replacement technically, and this script will not pretend otherwise. What keeps the original 23mm relevant is everything adjacent to raw performance. Its mechanical focus clutch, its smaller, older school handling, its reputation, already proven across thousands of professional frames, and its price, which on the used market makes it one of the more accessible ways into that specific 35mm Fujifilm rendering that helped define the system's early professional identity. At number 1, we have the Fujinon XF 56mm f1.2 R APD. Everything before this lens in the countdown made sense as a trade-off between age and convenience. This one is different because Fujifilm did not accidentally fall behind here. The company deliberately built a lens that made its own job harder in pursuit of one very specific outcome. The letters APD stand for apodization, and it is worth explaining properly rather than reducing it to a single line about nicer bokeh. An apodization filter gradually reduces light transmission toward the edges of a lens element, which smooths the intensity transition inside out-of-focus points of light. The practical result is background blur that fades rather than cuts, with far less of the hard-edged soap bubble outlining that ordinary fast lenses can produce. It is a genuinely elegant piece of optical engineering. It also came at a real cost. Reduced effective light transmission meant the lens metered slower than its stated aperture suggested. More significantly, the apodization element interfered with how light reached the camera's phase detection autofocus system, forcing noticeably different, often slower focusing behavior compared to the standard 56mm f1.2. Add a higher price on top of a narrower, more specialized benefit, and you have a lens that asked photographers to give up speed, certainty, and money, all in service of one aesthetic quality most casual shooters would never notice in a finished photograph. At launch, it carried one of the highest price tags in the entire X-mount lineup, and even now, well after discontinuation, used copies hold their value more stubbornly than almost anything else on this list, often trading close to what photographers paid for the standard version new. Weighing over 400 grams and requiring a longer minimum focusing distance than its non-apodized sibling, it was never a lens built for convenience, and Fujifilm's own positioning of it as a deliberate specialist tool rather than an everyday portrait prime only reinforces how narrow its intended audience always was. That is exactly why it disappeared from Fujifilm's lineup, and exactly why it belongs at number 1. When the standard 56mm f1.2 R eventually arrived, Fujifilm's newer optical design allowed for improved portrait rendering without carrying any of the APD model's operational baggage. Nobody claims it reproduces the apodization effect identically, but it made the trade-off unnecessary for almost everyone. The APD lens was never built to be practical. It was built to answer one narrow question as completely as possible, and once Fujifilm found another way to answer that question without the penalties, there was no reason to keep making it. That is what too specialized to survive actually looks like. Somewhere in your bag right now, there might be an older XF lens you never replaced, even after Fujifilm moved on from it. If there is, tell us which one, and what keeps it there. And if you think there is a sixth lens that deserves a spot on this list, leave the name below. We read every one of them. Fujifilm keeps building forward, and most of the time, it should. But glass does not expire the moment a newer version arrives. Sometimes the lens worth buying is the one everyone already stopped talking about. If that idea is one you want more of, subscribe to Alt Buzz Lenses, and we will keep pulling the forgotten ones back into the light.